All right, let's go ahead and get started, because we have 3 hours of together time with many of you guys who I did not see in commercial law, who know very little about commercial law, and those of you who took it, you may be like, I was afraid of it the first time, and now you were going to make me come back, right? All right, so we're going to split the time between two of the parts. Remember, there's Article 3 that deals with payment law, and then there's Article 9 that deals with secured finance, both of which are tested. And to kind of follow up on what Dean Singer said is, for the past number of summers, Florida has been testing some type of contract dispute on the bar question, and often it is combined with a UCC problem. So you may see, before they added Articles 3 and 9, it used to often seem like more often than not it would be contracts with Article 2. And then all of a sudden, now that we have 2, 3, and 9, last summer what came up was contracts and Article 9, but they've not tested Article 3. And so it wouldn't surprise me if they did something like, contracts with Article 3, which would be an easy combination. And so we'll spend half of our time on the Article 3 issues. We'll spend half of our time on the Article 9 issues. The best thing for you guys to do, because many of you guys, this is the first time that you're hearing any of this, is it's going to be a little stressy at points, I suspect. You're going to have to embrace what you don't know. Hopefully, has anyone already had this in their bar review program yet? One. Excellent one, right? You're the only one who's gotten to it so far. All right, so for the rest of you, this really is, unless you have me in class, this is the first time that you will be seeing this at all. My hope is that if you also have a bar review, that you'll get to it in your bar review, so maybe that'll be the second time that you'll be seeing it, right? And so that will help. It's not as good as having come to class with me, because we're going to try and learn a lot in a fairly short period of time. So what's imperative for you guys to do is not avoid it. If you guys avoid it, and I just told you, I think there's more than 50% likelihood that you'll have an essay on this. And it's probably higher than a 50-50 likelihood, since they've been doing this almost every summer with some kind of contract combination. And so how is it that you don't avoid it? Well, number one, you're here today. That's a fabulous thing. You're also going to do this in whatever bar review you have. And then here's my email. In your packet, you have a number of things, but one of the things in your packet you should have for today is a number of bar exam questions and answers. And what's in here are various and sundry bar exam questions, the one from Florida last summer that had Article 9 on it, but also ones from other states that have tested UCC questions. You would be wise to write some bar exam questions. Write some essays, especially those who have not had any commercial law. But I find even those who've had the commercial law, and then you have to write a bar exam question, sometimes the bar questions are organized a little differently in terms of strategy than standard law school questions. So it would be wise for you guys to write some. Now, if you don't write something from my packet, that's okay. If you write something from like the Barbary packet, that's good too. But just send me the questions so I know what it is that you're writing. But I am happy to try and review these for you guys. But if you guys did not take this, you guys got to write it. You can't afford to go in something that's more than 50% likely to come up and go into this unarmed. So that would just be sad. So I'm happy to review them if you guys write them. All right, so also in your packet, I did include one of the examinations that I gave in commercial law survey with some, I think there's some student answers to that exam. If you find that helpful, the reason why I included those is there are some multiple choice questions in there. It is possible that Florida will test UCC by multiple choice, but they haven't done so yet. So far it has been essay is what it seems to be. No, I guess multiple choice as well, but no Article 3 or Article 9 have been tested via the multiple choice. So I would be looking for an essay if I were you. And I like to predict things. And last year I actually predicted the exact thing that they would have on the bar exam, and all the students who had been working with me on it, they all knew that was like tip number 14 or something like that I sent around. And they were all quite happy because they were prepared for it. So the more we work on this, the better we get, right? All right. So can't cover everything that we would cover in an ordinary class. But we can cover some of the highlights, again, thinking in terms of prediction, what's more likely to be tested. And even if we hit the highlights, maybe there might be some subtleties that you guys don't get. But is there a chance that we can get you prepared for some of the major issues that might be an essay, even if for some reason in our hour and a half we can't get to all of the minor issues? Because if you can score enough points, to get on the road, you're probably still going to do fine even if you don't get all the minor stuff. So key topics when we're thinking about negotiable instruments, like I said, look, many specific and subtle rules. Concentrate on the main ones. What I'm going to try and teach you guys for both Article 3 and Article 9 are what I will call some of the main rules. And particularly what I try to do is I look at all the bar exam questions from all the various states, because we don't have a whole lot of history here in Florida, and figure out, well, what are the things that tend to get tested? And some of them tend to get tested a lot. And so I'll try and highlight some of that. So the bank's right to pay, fraud and error. Fraud is always big. Liability on an instrument. What is a negotiable instrument? And who is a holder in due course, and why does it matter? Now, some of these concepts, like these are all labels. These are using our big lawyer words today, right? And you're like, I have no idea what those big lawyers words mean. She just said she's going to talk to me about these 4 things, and I don't even know what those 4 things are. So that's okay. We'll get to it, right? All right. So I'm not going to take them up in that order, but those are the four main issues. I'm going to start with things that I think you guys can handle, and I'll kind of put them in the order that I see something as occurring. Now remember, it's Article 3 of the UCC, right? And so all of you guys probably vaguely remember studying some Article 2 of the UCC with respect to contracts, right? And you guys might remember that in order to be in Article 2 of the UCC, we have to have a contract for the sale of goods, right? And so that's a scope issue. We have a scope issue when it comes to Article 3 as well. You're not in, just like you're not in Article 2 if you don't have a sale of goods, you're not in Article 3 if you don't have a negotiable instrument. You're not in Article 3 if you don't have a negotiable instrument. Now it's interesting because some of you guys, I'll get you all the way down the pathway and you'll say, hey, there's not a negotiable instrument, but maybe is there a holder in due course? No. Holder in due course is a doctrine associated with Article 3. You don't go anywhere near Article 3 unless you have a negotiable instrument, right? And so what happens here is if we decide for some reason there's not a negotiable instrument, then you're not in Article 3, and it's just a plain ordinary contract, no matter what label you put on it. You put all the labels in the world on documents, but that doesn't make it something, right? You guys should have learned that by now. And so here, we might call something a promissory note, and it might be a promissory note, but maybe it's not governed by Article 3. Right? And so in those cases, your regular contract law would apply. I don't know. I've seen things like this where they'll have someone go through the analysis of whether something's a negotiable instrument, and your job is to say it is or is not, and if it's not, then the rights and obligations would be governed under contract law. That would be clever. Couldn't you just see Florida doing that since they haven't tested Article 3, and they like to test contracts? They could give you something, make you decide if it's a negotiable instrument. Maybe there's some problems with it. So what they're trying to bait you into saying is, oh, it's not a negotiable instrument, so the person doesn't get paid. It's not enforceable. Well, that's not true. If it's not a negotiable instrument, you just use your contract law. All it means is that you're not under Article 3. We got that? In order to be in Article 3, you must have a negotiable instrument. Otherwise, you defer to your regular rules of contract law. All right. So in order to have a negotiable instrument, We have a test and it involves 7 elements. You must memorize these 7 elements. These 7 elements are not somehow deducible by divination somehow, that you were just going to say, I just imagine there might be 7, and you would figure it out intuitively. It does not work that way. These are things you must actually memorize. Sometimes people will say, oh, there's 8, or sometimes I heard one professor say there were 5, and they're all correct. So if you ever read some book and it says, oh, there's only 5 or there's 8, it's all right, we're good. But most commentators see 7. Most people who will be reading your answers will be looking for the 7, or they will be prepared to know that you might say 7 even if they like to group some of them together or split them up more. All right, so this is our scope provision for Article 3, and it's actually 3.104, and the elements are you must have a written promise or order, meaning, and by written meaning it must be written, although electronic is fine, and the definitions are under the code and require that that writing be signed. So sometimes people will come up with 8 because they'll make signed its own little number. But the code doesn't quite do it that way, but you can get that direction. But this writing that we're talking about must be a signed promise or order, meaning a promise to pay, or on a check, a paid to the order of, right? I, Jennifer Martin, promised to pay Barbara Singer $10, right? That would be a promise to pay. And we'll talk, I think I've got some, let me see what I've got on the next page. All right. Yeah, unfortunately that's all I got. See, this is negotiable instruments light. In fact, each of these elements, there are additional code provisions that help you to explain what they all mean. Unfortunately for us, I guess we just don't have time to go into all of that, so I don't have slides on some of this for you. So written promise or order. Second, the obligation must be unconditional. Unconditional. Unconditional means without conditions. The classic bar exam that includes conditions will include an express condition of the kind we had in contract law. I promise to pay Barbara Singer $10 if she grades all my ILS exams for me. And there's probably no amount I could promise to pay you, right? So I promise, the promise would meet the first part, and I could do this in writing and sign, but then I put an if in there, right? If is classic language of condition. And by condition language, we're talking about a condition on the person who's supposed to pay. So, you know, I promise to pay her so long as she does this. If she does this, I'm not going to pay her otherwise, right? So we're looking for something that's a condition. Conditions that are in an item or a document would violate number 2. So we must have unconditional. So we're looking for a promise to pay that's unconditional. All right? So the third part is the amount of the obligation must be fixed, meaning we must know how much the obligation is. Do you see my example? I said I promised to pay her $10. How much money am I supposed to pay her? $10. If I said, on the other hand, I promised to pay her some amount of money that is sufficient for the task of grading my ILS examinations, that would not be fixed, right? And so amounts of monies that might be fixed, or if I said something, what else I've seen on bar exam questions, I promised to pay her the, for grading my exams, I'll pay her the amount of, 50% of the amount of royalties that I get on my new sales textbook 5 years from now. Do you have any idea how much that's going to be? I have no idea either. And so that would not be a fixed amount, right? Now, when it comes to fixed amounts, though, we can have interest. Interest is okay. So I could say I promised to pay Barbara Singer $10 at the rate of 5% interest per annum. That's okay, right? Or I could say I promised to pay her with interest at the prime rate plus 2%. we could figure out what the prime rate is, right? We just look it up in the magazine, in the Wall Street Journal, we could call the Federal Reserve, right? And so that's okay. That's still fixed for purposes of the code. All right, we good on that? So fixed, we have to have an amount, but adding interest is okay. Number 4, payment of money. I cannot say that I promised to pay Barbara Singer, I don't know, 2 batches of my famous Rice Krispie treats. If you grade my ILS exams. Now I've busted this in a couple of ways, right? I said it was 2 batches of the Rice Krispie treats, but we've got a condition and we don't have money involved. Sometimes we will see barter arrangements being written into something that might be a promissory note. Barter arrangements written into. Sometimes this will be a business. Well, I promise to give you my forklift if you send the bulldozer over in 6 months or something like that, right? That's not money. And so that type of arrangement might look like a promissory note or might look like a debt, but it just isn't, all right? So an exception to this money thing that sometimes comes up, particularly here in Florida, could come up, is whether the obligation is payable in US dollars or not. I have seen this only occasionally, but it wouldn't surprise me, wouldn't shock me if they did something like that here, where they said, hey, a family comes over from Brazil, and the daughter borrows $5,000 from mom and promises to pay mom the $5,000 with interest, but in Brazilian money. I don't know, what is Brazilian money?
Real.
It's the what?
Real.
All right, so they're going to pay it in that, or Chilean pesos, or whatever it is. Fill in the blank. Fill in the blank, foreign money, whatever your favorite foreign money is. Whatever we would put in one of these documents, if they put the money in foreign money, then that's still okay. And in that case, I could see them doing some of this. If that is the case, the maker, the one who's obliged to pay on the promissory note, can either pay in US dollars or in the Brazilian currency. And the exchange rate is determined at the time for payment, not at the time that the note is made. At the time for payment, not the time the note is made. And so payment in either US dollars would be considered payment or in the stated currency. It doesn't mean you can all of a sudden, pay in Chinese yuan or something like that. Yes?
But it's just cash. You can't pay, like, I promise to pay 10 shares of whatever stock I own.
Exactly. It's still money, but the money, stock is not money, even though it's often pretty liquid depending upon the stock. But we're talking about some type of currency, and by currency, Bitcoin would not count. That is not a currency. We're looking at a currency that is denominated as a currency by a government, either domestic or foreign. So only an actual currency would satisfy the money, but it doesn't have to be US dollars. That's still not cash. It must be money as determined by the government. If it's some commodity, that's not good enough. Commodities, stocks, other things options, other things that might be liquid and might be tradable are things that we could. I think it's interesting, but it's not going to be something that's going to satisfy these 7. We'll bust that one, and then it ends up being just a contract. Now, I have seen barter arrangements. I've never seen commodities. I have seen things where someone promises to give some stock. If mom gives me the $5,000 now, I'll give her my ABC stock in 6 months. That's okay. And we would say, hey, there's a promise to pay her with something, but it's the stock, and so therefore that's not a negotiable instrument, and so therefore it's a contract. It's not governed by Article 3. All right? what we end up doing here is we've got these 7 items. We march straight through the 7, and you need to have all 7. Don't skip over one of the 7. I've also seen, I'm teaching this to the ILS students, and sometimes they want to say, hey, we had a problem with number 2, so I'm done. They just kind of want to skip and say they're closed for business. The bar examiners are going to want you to look at how many of these elements? 7. Even if you bust number 2? Yes. Because sometimes when they do this, they'll make you have problems with 3 or 4 of the items just to see if you can tell what's a problem and what's not. And that's what your job is. You're supposed to look at all of them. All right, money. Payable to bearer or to order. Payable to bearer or to order. So we can write out an instrument and we can say, I promise to pay bearer $10, and I might hand this to Barbara Singer. But bearer means anyone who has possession of that item. If it could be a promissory note, it could be a check. But whoever has it can demand payment on it. We call making a presentment. Has anyone ever seen a check made out to cash? That would be a bearer paper. And so that would come under the umbrella of bearer. Sometimes we'll write out bearer. Sometimes we'll write out, to cash. Sometimes people don't know who to make a check out to, and they put nothing in the pay to the order line, right? They write a check out for $100, and they don't know who. Oh, I don't know how to spell their name, so I'm going to leave it blank. Well, silliness. You've now written the check out to nobody. You've made it bearer paper, and anybody who finds that thing can cash it. So don't do that, right? So bearer, that's what we're talking about when we say something has to be bearer. The other possibility is order. And by order, we mean to the order of an identified person. And by that, we actually mean it must say to the order of Barbara Singer. If it just says pay Barbara Singer, then it's not to the order of, is it? It must say, just like your guys' checkbooks. You guys all have checkbooks? You know how they write on that line, pay to the order of, and then you fill it in? They put that in there because of this. They don't want y'all screwing it up. And you would never remember to write, that whole to the order of thing. Who would learn that? So they print it on there for you. Because checks are going to be negotiable instruments because they're going to make it so hard for you to mess it up that you're not going to be able to mess it up if you actually issued the check. So, but if we're doing a promissory note, on the other hand, we're either going to look for the bearer language, or we're going to look to something that says, I promise to pay to the order of Barbara Singer $10. If I just say, I promise to pay $10 to Barbara Singer, that's not good enough. You see the difference? You must have that to the order of language. That one I've seen tested about a bazillion times. I test on that one all the time. All right. On demand or at a definite time. Requirement number 6. So on demand, most checks, in fact, all checks are on demand. You might date the check, but that has nothing to do with it. The reason is, if an item does not say when it is payable, then it is payable on demand. Otherwise, it will typically say, that payable on demand or at site, or payable 60 days after site, or pay on July 1st, 2014. All of those things are either on demand or at a definite time. We have to know when the obligation is due. Now keep in mind, just because it's silent, that's okay. Silent is okay because we presume that things that are silent are on demand. Things that are silent are on demand. So someone might bait you by just putting a date on something, and they want you to say, oh, it's not, we don't know when it's due. But that's okay. It's payable on demand. Something that's silent is payable on demand. If it does not state a time for payment, it's payable on demand. All right. The last one, no additional undertakings. We call this the courier without luggage. I find that people get number 2 and number 7 confused. Number 2, though, is conditions. And you all study conditions in contracts. So number 2 is talking about the stuff you learned in contracts. Number 7 is talking about something additional. What they're thinking is, hey, I said I promised to pay Barbara Singer $10. An additional undertaking would be something else I would promise. An undertaking is a promise. So an additional promise. So I promise to pay Barbara Singer $10 and I guess clean your car or something like that, right? Or your office. Or take your staff out to lunch or something really good, right? And so it doesn't matter what it is. We're going to be looking for some additional promise that's set forth in the promissory note. And usually this is going to be a promissory note. All right? Some additional promise. It could be a really minor promise. Oh, except did I have anything on this? Ooh. All right. When it comes to additional undertakings, there's a subtlety here, and I want to go ahead and explain this subtlety to you guys because it can come up on the bar. Sometimes that lenders will put things in commercial notes. If it's a company that's the lender, they'll say, hey, your company has to you promise to give us quarterly reports. That would be an additional undertaking, right? They promise to pay and give these quarterly reports. You all good on that? The opposite part, we actually have in 3104, there are some things that are not undertakings, not additional undertakings. And I didn't put them in the slides, but I'm just going to tell you guys, you need to write these down because I have seen these on bar questions. It might be that I'll see it in another one of my questions. But let's just go ahead and go over it now to make sure we all have it. All right. So, no undertakings, but the promise or order may contain, and I've got 3 things. Number 1, an undertaking or power to give, maintain, or protect collateral. So if the promissory note has collateral involved, and it says you, the promisor, promise to pay the car payments, and you're going to take care of the car as well, protect the car, that's okay. An undertaking or power to give, maintain, or protect collateral. So if it says in there, hey, there's also going to be collateral for this agreement, i.e. your car often, and you're going to protect that collateral, that's okay. Because we've just decided it's an exception, right? The law's full of exceptions. Sometimes I have seen this one on the bar and they want you to say, no additional undertakings, but that one's okay. That's what they want you to say. All right, are we good on number 1? All right, number 2, an authorization or power to the holder to confess judgment or realize on or dispose of collateral. Confessions of judgment, realize on or dispose of collateral. Sometimes lenders will put confessions of judgment or basically say that they're able to seize and sell the car, right? Yeah.
Can you repeat it, and when you're going through the rules, if you don't mind, can you just say it a little bit slower?
Oh, I know, it's crazy. Well, you guys should also go back and look at this. Y'all should have come to commercial law. Ms. Peterson has heard this before, right? All right, number 2. I know this is scary, isn't it? Are you guys terrified yet? We haven't even been at this for 30 minutes yet. All right, number 2, an author, and by the way, this is from 3104. 3104. An authorization or power to confess judgment or realize on or dispose of collateral. All right? All we're talking about here is oftentimes you'll see a fact pattern, and the fact pattern says that the maker agrees to a confession of judgment. And they want you to jump on, I learned those 7 things, and there's not allowed to be any additional undertaking. So they're trying to bait you into saying it's not a negotiable instrument, right? But of course, it's an exception. And so that's what they want you to say. All right? Somebody might try and bait you, but that one's okay. Are we good? I've got one more. Number 3. A waiver of the benefit of any law intended for the advantage or protection of the debtor. A waiver of the benefit of any law intended for the advantage or protection of an obligor, or meaning the debtor. So what does that mean? Well, remember we saw confessions of judgment are okay? A lot of times lenders will put in a document, you agree to a confession of judgment and a waiver of all your rights under, I don't know, some type of consumer law. Those are all okay. Those are, whether they're enforceable under, under relevant laws, a completely different issue. But it does not prevent it from being a negotiable instrument. All right? Because remember, always keep very focused. Only do the task at hand. And the task at hand is something a negotiable instrument. All right, back row, did you get all 3?
Actually, when you said a waiver of the benefit of any law intended for the advantage, or I missed that one.
Protection of the debtor. Yes, you are very welcome. All right, hiding in the back row. All right, guys, so we have 3 things. Oh, you have your hand up again?
No, I'm sorry.
All right, guys. So 7 things. Now, when are you likely to see this? Because that's one of the things you want to know, right? You are most likely to see this when you have a promissory note in your fax. You are most likely to see this when the bar examiner gives you a promissory note in the fax. You are not likely to see this when it is a check. Because all you would be expected to say if it's a check. Now, a check that has ordinarily been validly issued, meaning you filled it out. Can you manage to fill out a check? Do you have a checkbook? Have you seen these things? We all move money electronically. People hate checkbooks. Do you have one?
Yeah.
And you've issued these things, right? All right, because so they're made so easy that we can't mess it up. And so as a result, when you sign a check, are they in writing? And you actually sign it, right? Do you put any conditions on it somehow? Even if you tried, they're going to ignore it. You know what the banks do? They actually put things through machines. They almost never even look at your checks, so they're going to ignore that. Is it going to be a fix? Is it going to be fixed? Is it going to be an amount of money? Do you write checks for money? And do you write it for a specific amount of money? Yeah, you do. Wait. Oh, and it says that pay to the order language, right? All right, so we're still good. And do you date it? Oh, even if you forgot to put the date on it, that's going to be payable on demand anyway, right? And then you can't put any additional undertakings on a check because, again, I just told you they're going to ignore it. So is your check going to be a negotiable instrument? Yes. And you know what? The code makes it so. Aha! So we now come to a greater, so you guys are all praying now that you have checks on the exam because you won't have to do these 7. But I think it's the opposite because I think you can all do the 7 because you're all going to memorize the 7. If you have a check, though, don't go through all the 7. What you're going to say is that there are 7 elements that are required for a negotiable instrument, but a typical validly issued check satisfies all those 7. And you'll say, period. That's all you're going to say. Shakata, do you need me to say that one more time?
No, ma'am.
All right. So what you're going to do is do something short. And the reason is if you have a check, then the issue is somewhere else, and you don't want to waste too much time on that part. All they want you to do is say, hey, you've got a negotiable instrument under Article 3, and they want you to move on to whatever it is. Now, if you have a promissory note and they give you enough language from the promissory note, then you're probably what they want to see is the 7. So it doesn't mean if they give you a promissory note that it's surely the 7 elements that are at issue, but you need to be looking for that, right? Because it's likely if you have a promissory note, then that's something that you would have to do. Now, interestingly enough, last summer on the July 2013, it mentioned just offhandedly that the borrower signed a promissory note and a security agreement, but then they said nothing more about the promissory note. And the reason they did that is because it wasn't an Article 3 problem, and there was no issues about Article 3 under there. It just said they had a promissory note. So at that point, you just let it go. The issue is somewhere else, okay? So you must memorize them. You won't be able to argue this without it. You would never know those 3 different exceptions to the additional undertakings, right? So guessing would not help you. Meaning, however it is that you guys are going to master this by flashcards or quizzing yourself or somehow you're going to do this, you must memorize them. There is no way around it. And I would say there has to be 7. So this is, you know, if you didn't know this, how would you wouldn't figure this out. Like, oh, you know, I think if I didn't go to that class, that I just imagined everything should say bearer order. No, you wouldn't think of that. Nobody thinks that way. So this comes directly from the code. So let me give you an example. And you guys have this in your packet, but this is a question that came from Texas. And I like to call this one Homer's note. And this is one where they didn't put the whole note in the problem, but they gave pieces of the note in the problem, right? And so we'll come back to this later. But when people sign things, sometimes they will say somebody endorsed something or somebody signed something. But here they just did the slashes with the S and they said Eddie. That means Eddie signed it. All right. So if we're looking to see if somebody signed something. All right. So the question here, the lead question, they actually asked a question. I find that Florida is not nearly as direct as other states in giving you guys the call of the question. I don't know if they are likely to ask you if this is this a negotiable instrument. I think they're just likely to pitch you something and say, hey, what are everyone's rights and obligations, or can somebody sue somebody else, and can the other guy sue a third party or something crazy like that? Does that surprise you guys? No. So, when we think about the 7 elements, the first rule of the road is we just make our decision about negotiability at the time the instrument is issued. At the time it's issued. So things that happen later on don't affect whether it's a negotiable instrument under Article 3. So we're looking at the time that it was issued. So if you had this question, we would be looking at, we have here, it's interesting because they don't give you the full note. They tell you about the note. They tell you it was a typed promissory note, meaning that's our whole writing thing, right? They tell you it was signed by Homer. They say it was promising to pay $20,000 plus interest at the prime rate published in a magazine. To see if you understand that interest published somewhere else is okay, right? The typed date on the note was this. It says that it's payable to the order of Eddie. You see how this is following along our 7? If you didn't know the 7, you'd be toast. But if you know the 7, you're like, yes, I can do this, right? And it's payable 1 year from its date. So we know when it's due, right? The note also there was a possibility of extending the due date for 2 years, right? If something is due on May 26, 2009, but you could extend it for 2 years, it would then be due on May 26, 2011, right? You guys could do that math in your head. So adding 2 years, that's it. So that would still be at a definite time, no problem there, right? And so we kind of go down here, oh, it's supposed to be made from the savings account. We're okay with that. And then basically he signed the date next to his signature. So this is going to meet our elements of a negotiable instrument. I didn't see anything that got busted. All right. So interestingly enough, they also ask, when Stella took the note from Eddie, was it a negotiable instrument? Now, when did I say we make the determination if something's is a negotiable instrument? At the time it's issued. So someone is trying to bait you into saying it's not a negotiable instrument anymore. That's a big red herring. So the fact that they asked this is just meaning to confuse people. Because they had, when it was endorsed, they put pay only to Stella when she finishes painting my house. So the endorsements happen on what part of an item? Have you guys ever endorsed something? A check? Where do you endorse? Oh yeah, on the back. And so that's not the front. And that's not when it's issued. That happens later. So that stuff doesn't count for negotiability. It counts for other issues. And so that's just trying to confuse somebody here. All right. And the fact that the magazine ceased publishing means we would find some other interest rate. No problem there. So, all right. Let's see if I have anything. So you guys kind of get the idea how the 7 might come up. It could be like this. They could give you a full note. Or they could just give you a check, and of course you're just meant to make this short statement and move on. Yeah?
How's the fact that it has to come from a particular account, not a condition?
I think that my recollection is that that was just a source of where the payment was to come from. It's just a place where the money is. I guess if you had Brazilian money, you got to get that somehow from Brazil or someone who has Brazilian money.
Well,
So
I'm just thinking about it logically. It's infringing on my ability to
yeah, but I'm just telling you it's okay. Anyone who wants to know more? Oh wait, you know.
write that on the bar.
Yeah, you know. Yeah, well, remember, you know, you're not going to cite to the code in the subsection anyway on the bar. There, you know, I guess it would be really clever if you all cited a 3104 for the 7 elements, because then everyone will be thinking, gosh, you guys are super smart, and they won't know that you didn't even go to commercial law. For some of you, although you did, didn't you?
Yeah.
Yes. So you know more than the rest of us. What, didn't we discuss this? I don't think, you know, maybe it didn't come up. You know, I don't think it's a problem, though. I don't know. It may, you know, if there's an answer to that question, it would be, huh?
It seems like it's arguable.
Well, then I guess you would cover your backside by arguing that one either way. But I don't think that's good. You're still going to have a pretty good answer, though, right? On this one covering the 7. But I don't think it busts it. Yeah.
So for such if it were a condition or undertaking, does it fail as a negotiable instrument, or does that part just like?
No, if you mess up one element, you're not in Article 3. You do not have a negotiable instrument. There's no severing.
But on a check, if you do mess up and you write a condition, then they just don't enforce that part. It is.
No, we pretend it doesn't exist. Under the code, if you read all of if we read the code, it would tell us we can disregard all that. We just disregard it. So it's nearly impossible. I don't know of a way to make a check that has been validly issued not a negotiable instrument. You could even, by the way, because the code says this, and I've actually asked this kind of thing on exam, if you write on a check, because you're like, oh, I went to class, or at least I went to bar review, and I'm going to write on all my checks from now on, right up on top, this is not a negotiable instrument all over it in big letters. That's still not going to destroy it on a check. It would, though, on a promissory note, but it's not going to on a check. Not seen that on the bar, but I guess it could come up. I don't know how to do it with a check. The reason is it would just bring commerce to a screeching halt if all of a sudden our checks that we were writing on bank paper were not negotiable. It means every time you go to take somebody to the bank, it'd be like, oh, I'm sorry, I can't cash that for you. It's not a negotiable instrument. I guess you should go back to the person who wrote it to you. Oh, it's going to be a big headache, right? So checks, negotiable instruments, so long as they've been validly issued, right? So long as they've been validly issued. You know, if you don't sign the check, then it's not been validly issued. It doesn't meet number 1. Yeah, Bob.
As to the fixed date, the fact that the borrower can just unilaterally extend the date for another 2 years.
Still a fixed date. Okay. The fixed in that element under the code is really looking to a readily determinable date, determinable. And so we could determine when that date was. And so that as well. This is kind of clever, though. You see how they've written things into this problem to make you look at each of the elements and to see whether something does or does not satisfy it. You know, I think that there are rules of the road in which this comes out. That's going to make the definite time. You know, if you get most of them right, then you're probably good. You know, you're probably good to go. If you argued one and you got, I think you're wrong on that one. I think it's still okay. But I'll think about it. I can't remember if they had an answer, but my recollection was that at a specific account is all right. So, but what you're going to do is you're going to go through each one. But if you had all the 7 and you argued one both ways, but you came down, the wrong way, you still had your argument, you're still going to get most of your points for that, even if the exam writer disagreed with you on that one particular point. Right? You guys see that? What's important is that you use the facts to prove up each of these 7 elements, and the facts here are raising issues under most of the 7, right? There's enough facts here for us to do the 7 elements of negotiability, even though we don't have the full note in front of us. All right? All right, let's see. I think your answer on that one, I think it's in some comments somewhere to the code, which could scare you because they could be asking things that if you hadn't read the comments to the code, I don't think it's on the face. Yeah, so I mean, when you get to it, in my little short answer of it, I covered it right here. And I just covered it with one line, just kind of an observation that doesn't destroy negotiability. I think it comes from a comment, though. All right, so how does this really happen? Now, I do think in writing this that the way I presented this is a common presentation because we have 7 things to discuss, right? And so you see how it's laid out each of the 7 and then done the application for each of the 7. My suspicion is once you get over 3 or 4 things, it's harder to do in one just wraparound paragraph. So, and you don't want the bar examiner, whoever's reading your answer, to be looking for, oh, did you discuss factor number 4, and not give you the points for it because they can't find it, right? And so this type of organization is probably a successful strategy for laying this out. And make sure that you do the application, and by that we mean the facts that relate to each of these elements. You can't just say, oh, it's a fixed amount of money. You need to say it's a fixed amount of money because it says $10, right? When it comes to these types of questions, I probably would lead with a conclusion and a basic rationale, and then go into my more in-depth analysis. So if we wanted to say that, this 7 elements of negotiability will apply and be discussed in turn, just make sure that no matter what you do, whether you start with the conclusion or end with the conclusion, that you get the conclusion in there. Some of you guys will be better served by beginning with a conclusion just to make sure that you don't forget it or not get around to it because maybe of time or the like, right? All right, 7 elements of negotiability. That is them. That is something, well, I just showed you Homer's note. That was a bar question, right? That is how that might come up. All right, so yet another thing that you have to be thinking about with negotiable instruments is you have to be able to label the parties correctly. There are a lot of terms of art. And so there is some, in addition to the 7 items of negotiability, you've got to get the labels correct. So when we're thinking about a check, we have a drawer, and that's the person who issues the check. The drawee is the bank, and then the seller of goods or services is the payee. And the payee's bank is called a depository bank. The drawee bank is also called often a payor bank. Occasionally, we'll have one more bank in the middle, sometimes the Federal Reserve Bank, as an intermediary bank. And so depending upon how many banks you have, we might have to say, well, which bank has it, mostly when we get to issues of liability. So when we have a promissory note, it's a lot easier because we have a maker of a promissory note and a payee. So the labels there, maker, payee. But we have more parties involved with checks, right? Because checks are drawn on a bank and get paid through the banking system, right? Obviously, this is what a check looks like. You guys have all seen this, right? The payee is the person who you write on that line. Your signature at the below makes you the drawee. And we can see this is Second National Bank. Sorry, you're the drawer, and Second National Bank would be the drawee. Those are the labels which you need. You need to be able to identify the parties and use your lawyer words. All right. Now, Article 4 of the UCC is not tested on the Florida bar. Thank goodness. But there is one rule that I think if you hold in your head might be helpful for you guys in understanding some of the rules that actually arise under Article 3. Because remember, they're not drafted in isolation. So there's a rule under Article 4 we call it the properly payable rule. And this is 4401. It says, you know, the bank can only take money out of your account if the check or the item is properly payable, meaning you authorized it. So if, for instance, thief steals your checkbook and writes her name on the check and then takes it to the bank and the money comes out of your account, you're going to then call the bank, right? And you're going to say, hey, bank, you got to put that money back in my account because that check was not properly payable because I did not authorize it. All right? And so we see a lot of the rules from Article 3 as being drafted with that kind of backdrop in mind. So if we think about authorization as one of our key linchpins to liability, because ultimately we've got to decide who has to pay on the promissory note, who has to pay on the check, when do you have to pay on a check? This rule, I think, can be helpful because the drawer in the check is also called an issuer of a check. But if we say that an issuer has ultimate liability, right? But if you didn't actually issue the check, then it's not going to come out of your account, right? And so I think the rules on issuers and drawers are very much related, and the rule on acceptor banks is very related to this concept that comes up in Article 4, and if you understand this concept, it may help you with some of the others. All right. So there's a number of possibilities in terms of who is liable on a check. Said we were going to talk about what's a negotiable instrument. Now we're in Article 3, right? Presuming we got past that. Only then can we go to the other parts. All right. We say issuer of a note, also called a maker. Sometimes we say a check is issued, but other times we refer to the person who issues the check as the drawer. The reason we don't have just one set of rules for all issuers is because issuers of promissory note, the maker, it's just the payee and the maker. I promise to pay Barbara Singer $10. It's just the two of us, right? But once we have a check involved, it's not just two people anymore, right? There's a bank, at least one involved, and often two and sometimes three. And so that's why we get some additional rules that require us to specify liability, not just of issuers, but maybe of drawers and then of accepting banks, okay? And so we'll see issuers of a note, drawer of a check, endorsers, those who sign on the back of a check, or a promissory note for purpose of negotiation. Y'all should never be signing something without knowing what you're signing. When you turn a check over and sign the back of it, you think that, oh, it's just a signing the back of it. You probably never gave any thought to what that means, but it means you just assumed liability on that item. Transferors, someone who transfers, maybe even if they don't sign it. Presenters, the person who presents an item for payment. And then the drawee bank. Those are some of our people who might have liability. The bank, the drawee bank, is often called an acceptor or an accepting bank as well. Boys, did you guys just see this? You guys are like, I just gave like some of these people 2 or 3 labels. And I'm sorry, but they're all under the code, and so I can't help you. But there's times at which we seem to use one or more, depending upon whether there might be other people who fall within that definition. But all of these people, if we could give them the label, might have liability. So issuers and drawers, we ordinarily say, have absolute liability on the instruments they issued. And by that, remember 4401? If you authorize an item, then you have issued it, and therefore it's properly payable and you're liable on it. We're okay there, right? Now, there's a little bit of a wrinkle in this when it comes to checks. Because if you have money in your checking account and a check is presented for payment and you wrote the check, what's the bank supposed to do? Pay it, right? And so the way this works is a drawer, meaning if you're the check writer, their obligation is discharged if the bank accepts the item. Banks are supposed to either accept or dishonor the checks, right? I don't know if you ever thought about this, but you always hope it's not going to be dishonored or NSF. You always hope things are going to be accepted and it just goes through. Well, once a bank accepts it, then your liability is discharged as a drawer. All right, so this came up in some multiple choice questions that I think Barbary might have had last year, and some of the students had a question about this. And the question was, when would the drawer be obligated to pay on a draft, right? When would a drawer be obligated to pay on a draft? And the answer is when the draft is dishonored. So meaning if I wrote a check to Barbara and it was dishonored, then I guess she's going to get it back from her bank, right? And then she's going to bring it to me and said, hey, give me that $10. Well, because the bank didn't pay, she's going to come to me and ask me for the $10. Does that make sense? And so I'm going to have to pay on the draft myself if it's dishonored. If the bank takes it, I'm not going to do anything with it. The bank's going to take care of it, right? And so that's the way it works. When we write checks, where our money's in our bank account, we're expecting the bank is going to pay those checks. It's only if the item is dishonored that Barbara Singer is going to come and say, hey, do you have $10? And I'm going to go to my wallet, I'm going to have to give you $10. So the drawer is actually only obligated when it's dishonored, because when we write a check, we expect that the money's coming out of the bank account. And so this is actually on the face of 3414, and the particular provision I actually included and highlighted for you. But that would be a kind of a trick question, because our thought might be, hey, the drawer is always obliged to pay their check, right? But that's not true. The bank's supposed to take care of it for you. That's why you wrote a check. Because it'd be kind of confusing if you get your groceries and you write a check and you go home, and then next thing it's knock, 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 and it's Publix at your door. Can I have some money? And you're like, didn't I give you a check? Go ask the bank for the money, right? And so we don't expect they're going to come back to us unless somehow it was dishonored, and that's what the rules say. All right. All right. So those who issue items ordinarily have liability, subject to our rule on drawers that we just saw. There's also an issue about endorsers, those who sign on the back of an instrument. Now, technically, any signature that is not by the maker or the drawee on a negotiable instrument is an endorsement. But I've never seen a bar question except where an endorsement is in the right place. Endorsements are always where they're supposed to be, and they're on the back, unless there's some special clause set out in the agreement for some type of endorsement. But usually you're going to see endorsements. It'll just say that somebody signed their endorsement, or they signed on the rear side, or something of that nature. But ordinarily, this is what we're talking about. And we have two types of endorsements here. We have a blank endorsement when someone just signs the back of a check. If you get a check written to you and then you just turn it over and sign your name on the back, that you have actually turned it into bearer paper. It's like you just wrote cash on it. Because then if you drop it and somebody comes and picks it up, they would be able to take that to the bank, right? And so we actually often do special endorsements that pay to the order of Thomas Brown. Now, guess who can cash this check? Only Thomas Brown. There is a restrictive endorsement that many of us like to use, and all the banks want us to use when we're doing, when you're making deposits with your iPad or your phone. And it's the restrictive endorsement that says for deposit only. Has anyone ever done that? You sign your name, Jennifer Martin, for deposit only, and I'll put B of A and I'll put my account number or the last 4 digits of my account number. When we use this type of restrictive endorsement, it's still an endorsement, but guess what? Now the check can only be deposited in my account at B of A. If we just said for deposit only and we signed our name, it could go in any account that's owned by us. But those of you who have more than one account might want to make sure it goes in the right account, right? And so sometimes we will also write the bank's name or an account number on it. All right, so endorsements. Interestingly enough, remember I said when you put your name and sign something, it has consequences under the law. There is something called endorsement liability. If an item is written and you endorse it, and then it is dishonored, the next person in line may be coming after you under its 3415 called endorsement liability. So basically, we can imagine people in this, and you might be thinking, I'm just an innocent payee on a check or transferee. Well, we have endorsement liability. So if you sign the back of the check, then you are liable on the instrument, as it turns out, for 30 days. Endorsement liability lasts for 30 days from when you sign, but is only triggered by dishonor. It's only triggered by dishonor, and the exposure is 30 days. Now, most checks get cleared or dishonored within 30 days. You guys good on that? Wouldn't be true for a promissory note. They sometimes have longer lives. But at least here, when we're talking about endorsements, 30 days, only if it's dishonored. And as it turns out, you can go against anybody in the chain. So you could go against the person who, your predecessor in interest, or 2 people earlier, anyone who endorsed it, you could go against any of them, but you can only get paid once. Yes, Bob?
Just to clarify, you said 30 days runs from the
time you sign it. No, the date at which you sign your endorsement. So 30 days from your endorsement is the liability exposure. From your day of your endorsement, that's when the beginning. Usually if this comes up, it'll be an issue of, it'll be someone trying to bait you into saying there's endorsement liability when there's been no dishonor. Only trigger when dishonor. Or they'll give you something that where it was clearly that the endorsement was like a year ago. It'll be so far beyond the 30 days that there wouldn't even be a fact question about it. All right? It'll usually either clearly be with 2 days later, or it'll be like 9 months later where it's not even close. All right? Somebody had a question. Are we okay? All right. And the reason this is going to come up is if the drawer doesn't have the money in their account, and so maybe they have gone to hinterlands unknown, or they just don't have any money, meaning they're insolvent, everyone is going to be looking to shift the loss to someone else. I like to think that negotiable instruments is like the childhood game of hot potato. You don't want to be holding the hot potato when the music stops, right? Secure transactions, another game altogether. But here, this is like hot potato, and if the drawer would have the loss, but they're not around, oh, sorry, that's going to come your way, right? And so what are you going to want to do? You're going to want to pass the loss to somebody else. And so we will pass the loss probably up the chain of the transferors, probably to the earliest solvent person is usually the way that's going to work. Endorsement liability. Oh, let's see. How are we doing on time? I'm going to actually pass over Homer's because we've got more stuff to do. All right. So you'll have to look at Homer on your own. Because I'm already running behind. And I think I only have to like 4 and then we take a break, right? Time travels fast when we're doing Article 3. Because you guys are having so much fun. All right. So remember I said about the banks and the whole check thing and that, you know, sometimes we expect our banks to pay. The bank has to make a choice. They can either dishonor your check or they can accept your check. They don't get to decide, oh, I just don't know what I'm going to do today. No, they have to either accept or they have to dishonor, and there's all kinds of rules that force them into that. Now, because of that, once the bank accepts, they are liable on the instrument because we already said the drawer is discharged upon acceptance. The drawer is only liable when it's dishonored, which means we got to set up a system where somebody is liable, and it would be the accepting bank. So if they accept, they're liable, or if they dishonor, oh wait, that's when we get those darn endorsers on the hook, right? All right. What, it's a lot? You confused?
Once the bank accepts it, the drawer's not liable anymore, and the endorsement, it doesn't, you're not liable as the endorser.
Exactly.
So, if a check, the bank takes it and accepts it, what if when the bank doesn't know if it's going to bounce or not until it bounces?
I guess they're going to have to figure that out before they accept it. Now, there's rules in the collection system that are beyond the scope of what we have to do here. Just presume that at some point in time, under the rules, they'll have to either accept or dishonor. And it's more than we have time for here, because we got more. We got other stuff here. I got presenters and transferors. You know, I used to think that presenters and transferors would never be asked about, but I can't say that anymore. It seems like all of a sudden some bar examiners have wanted to start. Maybe I guess, oh, you guys all know about those 7 elements of negotiability, so we're going to have to ask you something harder. So in the code, there is transfer warranties and presentment warranties that are made. And the way this works is those who present, which is always the last person. So here on the upper side, we see only the payer bank can use presentment warranties, and other people can use transfer warranties because the item is presented to the payer bank for payment. Everybody else is transferring the instrument through the process of what we call negotiation by endorsing the instrument. And so it's a little complicated, but basically these transfer and presentment warranties, even explaining them is more than I'm prepared to do for you guys today, because you'd actually have to read the code. It ultimately protects the predecessors against things like alterations and incomplete items, and a lot of times the fraudulent items. But there is a potential, and I think the way you want to phrase this is sometimes there may be a potential for, if you've got someone who's a transferor that might want to go against someone else, you would at least want to raise the issue that there might be transfer liability on behalf of those who transferred, or they might be presentment liability of those who presented to the payer bank if the payer bank is the one who has the hot potato, right? And that's probably all I've got time to tell you about that now. I think what you guys should be thinking about is we have potentially drawer liability, issuer liability, accepting bank liability, we have endorsement liability, and that this presentment and transfer, you know, I think it's a little loose if it would come up. I think it's like kind of one of those last little things you could mention. I think if you mentioned it, you're probably going to get some of the points, even if you don't go into all the details on it. All right, because I've got to move on to other things. Who has claims against whom for what? And when we kind of look at this, we've got, you know, drawers and payer banks and drawees and intermediaries. And basically, we have a possibility only the payer bank can claim the presentment, but the others can claim the transfer and endorsement. One of the things that drawing stuff out may help you guys to do is just to give everybody their correct labels, because we've just got a lot of labels floating around here. And so if you can just, when you get a long fact pattern with a lot of people, you might be, you know, benefited by just drawing a simple diagram. It's usually, I just draw the little 4, four-corner diagram and see if you can figure out who everybody is. Because once you figure that out, it's a whole lot easier to figure the liability. All right. So what we've discussed so far, I know, don't you wish you would have come to class now? Wow, it's a lot, and Article 9's harder. This is the easy one. All right, so basic liability, I think, is already determined. The drawer is responsible if it's dishonored. The accepting bank has to pay. Endorsers might have to pay if the item's dishonored. You start seeing that system, right? And so we've got a basic liability system for the negotiable instruments, but we also have some special rules because that's the way the law works, right? And so even once we have our regular rules, we start to think we know who is responsible. Maybe the person who was the issuer says, hey, I wasn't the issuer. I never signed that thing, right? And then all of a sudden, we look to special rules and we find a way to shift the hot potato back to somebody, right? And so that's what the special rules do. Unauthorized signatures, negligence, alterations, employees, mistake, fictitious payees, and conversions. So that's a lot of special rules, right? And they do come up when these have been tested on the bars, because now we're getting into complicated. We're now looking to an exception to the normal rules, right? So the thing is, I would suspect that Florida would combine this kind of question with a contract question, because that seems to be how they've tested UCC in the past. But I can't say that for sure, because many other states combine these types of issues with criminal law, with family, with estates. Because some type of fraudulent check from grandma's estate could be a wills and trusts issue, right? Or come up along with it. Or it could be the kind of thing that lands somebody in jail, right? So I have a problem that gives you an example of it. Not yet, though. We'll get to it in our 10 minutes. I know we have to go really fast. So exception number 1, unauthorized signatures, meaning an issuer actually needs to be an issuer. So unauthorized signatures are only effective of the signature of the person who signed. So if somebody takes my checkbook and signs my name, that's not my signature and I'm not liable. Easy exception, right? Meaning the issuer must really be the issuer and the drawer must really be the drawer. And it's not good enough for somebody who wasn't authorized to sign your name to sign your name. Easy rule. Negligence, though, is a little bit harder. I think allegations of negligence rarely, and you should write this down, allegations of negligence rarely work to shift the liability. Allegations of negligence rarely work to shift the liability. But it is there in the rules. If your negligence contributed to alterations or forgery and somebody else acted in good faith, then we could shift the loss to you. But in the code, they have examples of what the code writers thought was negligence, and it's set here. An employer who leaves a rubber stamp with the employer's signature in an unlocked drawer along with the checks is negligent. That's their example. That sounds pretty negligent, right? If you, I don't know, do you know where your checkbook even is? Yeah. How many of you guys have no idea where your checkbook is? Well, does that make you negligent? Probably not. Do you have a rubber stamp right, sitting right with it, and anybody can come into your house? It's got to be something really, really bad. So yes, there's a rule on negligence. Sometimes this is one where we could raise it. Well, maybe Sam might argue that somebody was negligent, but it's not likely to prevail, right? All right, negligence. All right, alterations. Alterations fraudulently made discharge a party whose obligation is affected, but it's enforced as initially issued. If I wrote a check for $10 out to Barbara Singer, And she said, well, you know, maybe I could put a couple zeros on the end of that. That would be an alteration, right? So I'm on the hook for $10, but not the extra amount. That's what the rule says. So the drawer is responsible for the amount that was issued. And additionally, the endorser, remember there's a possibility that an endorser could be on the hook. The endorser is responsible for the amount when it was endorsed. So if you endorse it and it says $10, but then you hand it to her and then she writes it for she changes it to $1,000, you're only on the hook for $10 too. All right. So when the we gauge this from when the instrument was issued in terms of the people who would be liable. And by the way, in case you're asking, where does that usually mean the hot potato will usually end up? Usually the hot potato ends up at the dry bank. Under old-fashioned presumptions that presume that the bank set up this whole nonsense to begin with, they're supposed to know their customers. They have no idea who you are, I'm sorry. And they don't know you either. They don't know me. And they've set up a system because everything is done electronically where they don't know who you guys are. And so most of the rules often tend to put liability on the dry bank, you know, or not allow them to get out from underneath it if they would have it, right? All right. Employee fraud. Employee fraud, interestingly enough, is very restricted, and all employee fraud is not under the employee fraud section. We could have an employee fraud that was in the under the erroneous signatures. Remember, the thief that steals my checkbook? What if it was one of my research assistants who stole my checkbook? And does that mean somehow that we're going to change up the rules somehow? No, it doesn't. That rule's there. The employee fraud rule is only about endorsements. Endorsements are where on a check or a promissory note? On the back. So sometimes a bar examiner will try and trick you into saying, oh, it's the employee fraud rule, and it has nothing to do with the employee fraud rule because employee fraud rule relates to endorsements on the back. So if we actually had a situation where we had endorsements on the back, where we had an employee who was perpetrating the fraud, in those cases, the employer can be liable. But only where the employer had someone who was actually given responsibility with respect to the financial dealings of the company. So if the janitor steals some checks out of the mail and forges some endorsements, a janitor was not given that kind of authority, right? But if it's the bookkeeper who is in charge of those things, who then steals some checks and makes the fraudulent endorsement, then the employer would have the liability, even though the endorsements were clearly fraudulent, right? Endorsements, but this is on the back, and it's called the employee fraud rule. And so it's just meant to mess with you guys. It's meant to bait you guys into thinking all employee fraud rule is under the employee fraud rule, and it's, you know, it's not. All right. Oh, I'm going to skip over mistakes because the mistake rule, actually I'll just say, there's a rule that allows shifting for mistake, but it's written with such a big exception that it never applies. You know, so we never use it. So that's one of those you might say, oh, somebody paid by mistake, so therefore the bank shouldn't be liable. No. All right. So here we are, another area where employees might be involved. That's not the employee fraud rule, is this rule on imposters and fictitious payees. Sometimes you'll see a situation where you'll have an employee and they will issue an instrument on behalf of their employer by impersonating the payee. So either someone could show up and say, hey, I'm Bob, your construction guy, and please write me a check, and you would write the check, and silly you because I'm clearly not Bob, right? You should check my ID. Other possibility is fictitious payee. The employee often will take the check, and I'm going to write the check for our employer out to Bob, the builder. And I have no intention that Bob is going to get paid because what I'm really going to do is I'm going to steal that check and deposit it in my own account, right? And so in that case, that's a fictitious payee. We don't intend for Bob to have any interest in this, do we? Even if Bob was a real person, we wouldn't intend for him to have any interest in this, because that's the scheme, right? And so in those cases, you know, we say that the endorsement is affected by those taking in good faith. And so that's a loss shifting when we have imposters. I guess if in the imposter situation, you're supposed to check someone's ID, and with a fictitious payee, basically we just have a rule that we've just decided those who take these things in good faith might not know otherwise. Conversion. There is a rule for conversion under 3420. Boy, this is a lot of rules, right? So the law of conversion, do you guys study law of conversion like in property or somewhere along the lines? Torts. Common law of conversion also applies under the code. So if you have a check in your book somewhere and somebody steals that check and you can find them, or a bank ends up having it, you can bring an action in conversion to get your check back, because what if it was your paycheck and it was a lot of money? Right? And so we can get that back, just make a claim in conversion. That's 420. This is one of the few rules that actually helps the payee. Because remember, oftentimes it's the drawer that has all the rights, or, you know, other people have, you know, we haven't really said anything about the poor payee. The payee might have a right to get paid, but, you know, if their check is stolen, what good is it for them, because they don't have it? So they do have a right to bring an action in conversion. So we end up with a system that kind of, we could draw it out and figure out who's liable. New York bar examination, July of 2011, Dan the insurance man. So on this question, I just wanted to show you guys how sometimes a bar examiner could combine a criminal law problem with a negotiable instruments problem. Because in this problem, he's been actually having checks issued from his employer, and then he's been cashing them on his own. Sure, it's an Article 3 liability person, but what happens if you steal checks from your employer? I think you might be going to jail. So there might be an issue under criminal law as well. And I think this one even had a criminal procedure question when an officer did a stop of Dan. Wow, I know. You end up with criminal law, criminal procedure, and they threw in a little Article 3 here in New York. So this is a good one just to take a look at, because you also need to just spot them, right? You don't have a chance of getting it if you can't spot it. I think we need to stop and take a break. I'm not quite done with Article 3, but we will go back to a little bit of Article 3 left when we come back from our break. Let's take just 10 minutes. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you to Barbara. All right. So I wanted to say to you guys, remember in the slide presentation, there are some, you know, like with 7 elements of negotiability, there's a example of how you might lay out an answer, right? When you get to the packet of papers, you'll see some former exam questions, and a lot of them, where they were available, have some, you know, answers. This is how you might have answered the question. You want to be answering questions like others have answered questions. Now, what's going to happen is when you leave here, you should find some questions to write for me, and you don't look at the answer. You write the answer, then you send it to me, and I'll see how you did, and we'll give you some feedback on it, right? Then once you've written it, then you look at the answer, right? All right. But there are plenty of things for you guys to write. We've got a little bit of Article 3 to finish up before we move on to Article 4. So we've got a couple of concepts. We've already been talking about endorsements, right? So the reason we care about endorsements is eventually we've got to decide who gets the money. Someone ultimately is going to want to present what's called presentment. They're going to present a check for payment, or they're going to present a promissory note for payment. And so we have to know who's entitled to get the money. So if we have a negotiable instrument, it means it can be negotiated. And negotiation is just a fancy word for transfer, but we use our lawyer words and we say negotiated, right? And so we negotiate it, and if we negotiate it from somebody to somebody else, that somebody else becomes a holder. Now the payee is always the payee, but they can be a holder as well. But the item is not negotiated to the payee, it's issued to the payee, and then the payee negotiates the item to the holder. So if I were to issue you a check, you then could negotiate it to someone else. Often it's your bank, all right? The whole idea here is a holder has a right to call for payment from someone who is obliged to pay, meaning they are a person entitled to enforce. We call that a peat. Now, of course, holders are subject to defenses to payment. Defenses to payment. A holder's right to get payment is subject to any defenses to payment. Meaning, oftentimes, it's a breach, if there's a breach of contract. If I wrote a check to somebody because they were supposed to sell me a book, but they never delivered a book, then they might be a holder of the check, but I'm probably going to stop payment on the check, and therefore it's going to be dishonored, and I'm going to have a defense, right? Breach of contract. All right, so we kind of looked at endorsements already. And this whole idea of negotiating to a holder takes on some importance because of these darn defenses. Well, if you are just a holder, and you know, this check gets negotiated to other people and they're holders, and then they bring it to me for payment, and I say, oh, but you know, they never gave me the book. And so that would be a basic breach of contract offense. Oftentimes we find commercial parties don't want to deal with this. So if someone's a holder, they would have to deal with all the defenses. And sometimes we know that that's going to happen. There are people out there who collect bad debt, for instance, right? They probably pay pennies on the dollar or a very small percentage on the dollar for these things, and then they know there are problems with them, and maybe they'll present it to you and you're like, I already paid that 6 years ago and look, right? But they'll try, but they're a holder, but they're subject to defenses, maybe payment, maybe, you know, breach of contract, maybe discharge in bankruptcy, right? Statute of limitations, all kinds of stuff. So holders have to listen to all that chatter, but a holder in due course, on the other hand, does not. And so sometimes a holder is going to want to say, well, I'm not just a holder, I am a holder in due course. So the payee, while they can be a holder, you just have to trust me, the payee is pretty much never a holder in due course. Almost never a holder in due course. So I've never seen a question or even given a question myself where I had any kind of issue about whether the payee was a holder in due course. It's always about the payee negotiating the check or the promissory note to someone else, and the question is whether that transferee, who's a holder, is a holder in due course. So just a moment here. If we have the payee, they're the ones that are entitled to get paid, right? And we transfer a check that's made out to cash just by moving possession, right? I think we did that with Vigiano in class. And I did it today with the ILS students. We just wrote out a pretend check and we passed it around. We wrote cash on it and we could give it to you, and then you could pass it around. We could pass it all the way to the end, and whoever has it can present it for payment. They're the holders. So if something is bearer or cash, we don't need endorsements. We can just possession alone. For someone to be a holder, on the other hand, in the event that something is written out to them, then we have to have a transfer of possession plus an endorsement. That makes it a negotiation. All right? So normally, if something is made out to the order of Barbara Singer, she would have to endorse it in order to send it to somebody else. So if we're thinking about wanting to be able to strip people of defenses, then we have to establish that we're not just a holder in due course. A holder in due course is sometimes known as a super holder because there's not a lot of defenses to paying. The defenses are all about, do I have to pay you? And if you're a holder, I might have some defenses. If you're a holder in due course, that's a tougher thing I might have to pay. So in order to be a holder in due course, you must actually be a holder, meaning you took this through the process of negotiation, meaning you're a holder of a negotiable instrument, right? You would have to take in good faith, meaning you haven't taken it in bad faith, for value, and without notice of problems with the instrument. Value does not mean the face amount of the note or the check. We could pay value, that's something less, but we must actually pay what we promised. So if I'm paying you, $8 for a $10 check, then that's fine, but I must actually pay the $8 for it to be value. So it's not necessarily the same thing as consideration. Value and consideration are not the same thing for purposes of Article 3. Because remember, in contract law, consideration and executory promise is good enough. But here, with Article 3, it's only value to the extent it's actually been performed. All right. So if somebody is a holder in due course, meaning they can go through those elements, oh, and I'm sorry, you have to memorize those elements as well. No way you're going to guess that. Oh, yeah, I just wanted to think someone might be a holder in due course. No, you're going to have to memorize that too. All right. So the reason we care about this is about the defenses. Somebody is a holder and they want to get paid, and I don't want to pay them because I say, hey, breach of contract or whatever other nonsense I want to say. And so if someone's a holder in due course, then they can strip most of those defenses. And this is in 3305. And I like to say there are two types of defenses. Real defenses, which are in A1, are good against a holder in due course. Personal defenses, which are in A2, are not good against a holder in due course. So let me take up A2 first because I think it's the easier one. A2 is our basic breach of contract. If you're a holder in due course, then the drawer or the maker cannot assert a basic breach of contract claim in order to defeat the right of a holder in due course to get payment. All right? So that would include, the breach of contract argument it would also include mistake, it would include misrepresentation, it would include unconscionability, basic breach of contract, anything you studied in contracts for the most part, you can't assert against a holder in due course, unless it's on the A1 list. There are a few things that even a holder in due course cannot defeat. Most things the holder in due course can defeat. So, what can't they defeat? Infancy. If the promissory note was signed by my 9-year-old son, Leland, then you're not going to be able to get him to pay even if you are a holder in due course. Good luck with you. All right. Duress. If we put the gun to somebody's head and then we transfer the promissory note around, that one as well, that argument is good even against a holder in due course. All right, small window. And there's one, bankruptcy discharge. If there's a bankruptcy discharge, even a holder in due course has to respect that. The last one is the one that confuses everybody. And I'm going to state it this way because I find the books sometimes use different labels and they don't always use them correctly. And then everybody gets confused. The labels that everyone gets all confused about are fraud in the factum and fraud in the inducement. Yeah. I know, I just don't use, I would advise you not to use it. I have come to the conclusion that you guys are going to be misled, or the person who's reading your exam might be misled. So our regular garden variety fraud, misrepresentation, hey, the house had ghosts, the house had termites, you cannot assert that against a holder in due course. There's only one kind of fraud you can assert against a holder in due course, and it's fraud that induced the obligor to sign the instrument with neither knowledge nor reasonable opportunity to learn of its character. And so I would advise you guys that you are best suited to memorize that phrase. And you know why? Because that's the one that seems to get tested. Great, right? Says if there was something that has to do with a holder in due course that's most likely to be tested, that would be it. fraud that induced the obligor to sign the instrument with neither knowledge nor reasonable opportunity to know of its character. So let me give you a couple examples. Example I have in the box. You're buying some products at my store. I give you some piece of paper. I say, hey, it's just a receipt. And I'm like, oh, and you say, no problem. I'll sign the receipt. And you sign the receipt. I told you it was a receipt, but actually it was a promissory note. Well, that would be fraud that induced you to sign that, right? Or conversely, I say, hey, don't you want to send a bunch of greeting cards out for the holidays? And I bring you all the greeting cards. Look, I filled them out for you. All you got to do is sign them. And so you sign them. And guess what? There's a promissory note in there too. Yeah, but don't use that. I wouldn't use it. I wouldn't use it. Because fraud in the inducement versus fraud in the factum. Look at the code here. Fraud that induced. Fraud that induced. That's what the code says. The fraud says fraud that induced. So if you say that that's fraud in the factum, but that's not fraud that induced, you're just going to confuse yourself. Which one's inducement and which one's not inducement. Don't go there. Especially under the stress of an exam, right? It's just not worth it. Because fraud that induced is the one that's good against the holder in due course. Another example. If we say you're signing the attendance sheet, but in fact there's a secret paper in there that makes your signature go through to a promissory note, that would be fraud that induced. You guys are good on that, right? Another possibility is if I tell you, this one, there's a couple other possibilities. I tell you that you're signing a promissory note, but I say it's the promissory note for your house here. Oh, but in fact it was the promissory note for my house and you're paying for my house now. That would be fraud that induced you to sign it, right? There's a little bit of a wrinkle on this. It says fraud that induced the obligor to sign the instrument with neither knowledge nor reasonable opportunity to know of its character. There is an old case, I think it's Nebraska or Kansas, with a farmer, and he's out on his tractor in the middle of farmland. And they bring him the promissory note to sign. And somebody tells him, I think, that it's like a small amount of money. And it wasn't a small amount of money. It was like 10 times more than he thought he was signing for. And so he doesn't bother to go get his glasses so he can read the amount he was signing for. Because his glasses were in the house and he was out on the tractor, and he just signs it. In that case, the court said that he had opportunity to know what he was signing, even though fraud induced him to sign it, and so his defense was not good against a holder in due course. All right. I would avoid using fraud in the inducement or fraud in the factum because I just think you're going to get confused, or the person who's reading your exam is going to get confused. It's either A1, fraud that induced the obligor to sign the instrument with neither knowledge nor opportunity to know of its character, and it's every other fraud you can not assert against a holder in due course. All right. Let's see. I'm in car. All right. With that, but don't, the whole holder in due course, know the elements and know which things you can assert against a holder in due course and which things you can't assert against a holder in due course. And watch for that fraud, because that always seems to be the one that comes up, and you don't want to get the rules flip-flopped because it's just so easy to do. It's so easy to do that I've abandoned the whole concept of giving it labels, because labels only work if we all know what the label means, right? If I made up some crazy acronym but you had no idea what it meant, then how is it going to help you? Or if your exam reader might think it meant the opposite thing, that's not going to help you either. So track the statutory language, you will be better off, and that is my advice to you. All right. So we're going to learn a little bit of Article 9 in the 1 hour that we have left. I know, my goodness, we're starting a whole other article of the Commercial Code. All right. So I've got 4 things for this one too. 4 things. This is the one that was tested last year on the Florida bar. So in your packet, you'll see the first question that's in your packet is the Florida July 2013 exam question number 1. Literally, you would have opened your book and that was what would have been staring you in the face. Contract question with a security interest under Article 9. I asked Lauren Tamaro, who graduated last year and took that exam. She is very kind. She wrote up an answer for you guys, a model answer. So bless Lauren. So this is coming around. I edited it for her to kind of, even it out a little bit. It's still 4 pages, though. It's a long question. No, the 4-page answer, yeah, in 1 hour. Silverberg can do that and probably twice over. Oh, he types 20, he probably did 8 pages in 1 hour. All right, but Lauren did 8. I don't know how long it is that she wrote this, but there was a lot in the question, is the point. Now, she wrote you guys a model answer for this, and it's a pretty good answer. So you want to kind of think about how you might be writing this, because that's a good example. And what they did, though, is they did a common law contract and then a UCC Article 9. And so I think that's clever, because they could have done Article 2, right? They did 2 contracts there. Both of them were common law, and then they did they did not 1 but 2 loans under Article 9, and they had competing creditors. Wow, right? All right. So if you're going to, what I think is interesting, the way that the answer with Lauren plays out, is it does cover this progression. Creation of a security interest. Did somebody create a security interest? Did somebody perfect their security interest? Priority of competing interests, and then debtor default. Wow, I just mentioned that most of that was covered in last year's bar question. And so there is a natural progression to how we do these things. Now, what we're talking about when we talk about Article 9 is we are talking about consensual interests that are given in personal property. We're not talking about some type of judicial lien that was done. We are talking about people going out and creating voluntarily an interest in their personal property. You buy a car and you sign a note and a security agreement, right? And what happens if you don't pay on your promissory note? They repossess your car. None of this surprises any of you guys, right? Some loans are unsecured, like credit cards. I guess and student loans, unsecured debt. They cannot come repossess you. Other loans, though, are secured, and what we mean by that is that there is collateral for the loan. Now, the collateral for the loan is whatever we said it was in our security agreement. All right, so creditors could get liens by going to court. We could have statutory liens. Those things exist, all of that. But Article 9, we're talking about consensual, and we're not talking about mortgages. We're talking about personal property here. Oh, I just got done giving you guys all that other labels and acronyms and all these buzzwords for Article 3. You have a new language for Article 9. You might wish that they all use the same, all the code provisions, all the articles of the code use the same language, but they don't. So unfortunately, now if you have, in the problem from last year, it said there was a promissory note and a security agreement, but then they went on to talk about the collateral. That was a heads up. There was no more information about the promissory note, so that question was not an Article 3 question. Even though they mentioned promissory note, they said nothing else. You'll be looking for facts about a check or about a promissory note and about somebody not paying on it, right? If you've got an Article 3 problem. If you've got an Article 9 problem, you're going to have some agreements that are made, and one of the terms of art is going to be this darn security interest. So how does this work? I like to say, even though Article 3 is the darn game of hot potato, Article 9 is the game of musical chairs. Yes, musical chairs is often best played by those who are not asleep while they're playing it, right? And so musical chairs, if you ever watch kids playing musical chairs, they're wandering around and they're like, no, yeah, I know, I'm going to be, when the music stops, I'm probably going to be over there and I'm going to grab your seat before you can grab it, right? And so sometimes we have this idea that we might be able to reserve seats in advance. So what if there are only 3 chairs and I reserve them all in advance? Do you have a hope of sitting anywhere? No. Sorry, I got all the chairs. You get to sit on the floor. You're out. Because what happens when the proverbial music stops means that the debtor has no more money and the bills are going to go unpaid. If I have all the chairs, then that means that the collateral is all mine. And I guess you will get 0 cents on the dollar in bankruptcy court. So how do we know whether we have a valid security interest? This is one where there are classically 3 interests. And again, I'm so sorry, you must memorize these because you would never guess it. All right. 3 traditional requirements. One is that value is been given by the debt. Usually it's the lender, gave $5,000 to the borrower kind of thing, right? Second, debtor has rights in the collateral. And what that means is you can't give a security interest in your neighbor's house or your neighbor's car. That would be great. I can go take out a loan and it's on your car. And so if it goes unpaid, they'll just come repossess your car. That wouldn't make any sense, right? So debtor must have rights in the collateral. And the third requirement is that there must be an authenticated security agreement, meaning it's been signed. But here is the caution to our tale. 3 things ordinarily required, but then last year on the bar exam, they tested something that would be an alternative to number 3. There are alternatives to number 3. Oh, yikes, right? This is like that other one. You thought that you're okay memorizing those 7 things, and you find then there are 3 exceptions to number 7. All right. So let's talk about the exceptions because Florida did this last year. Normally, we'll be looking for an authenticated security agreement. Authenticated means a signed writing. So you know what they gave last year? They gave one was an oral security agreement. Oh, darn, right? And so we've got some exceptions. So let's see, 1, 2, I've got 3 exceptions. So you guys ready? If we could have the authenticated security agreement, but our other possibility is possession pursuant to a security agreement, possession of the collateral. And by that, it still says security agreement because you still have to have a security agreement, but it could be oral. And that's exactly, well, it's almost what they did. We'll put that off. Possession pursuant to a security agreement, but it could be oral. Alternative 2. If we have certificated securities, meaning stock that's in certificate form, we would have the stock certificate delivered to the creditor pursuant to a security agreement, but it could be oral. You see how we're going here? Oral security agreement plus possession, oral security agreement plus possession of the certificated security. And then, are we good so far? All right. Number 3, the collateral is deposit accounts. It's really deposit accounts that we're going to care about, pursuant to the debtor's security agreement. Again, deposit account that the creditor controls. Deposit account that the creditor controls plus a security agreement, but it could be oral. So interestingly enough, when we have a written security agreement, written signed, that's good. But sometimes you'll see the fact pattern where it says there was an oral security agreement, but what they did on July 2013, they made it a deposit account at the bank that was the lender. And so a deposit account at your bank, does your bank have control of that? Yeah, they sure do. And so if you just orally agreed to the security agreement, that would be fine. And they, so long as they actually lent you the money and it was your account, they would attach their security interest to it. You must attach the security interest before we can do anything else with it. Yes, Bob?
So the second one was the collateral in the form of stock exchange?
No, not stock exchange, certificated securities. Now, it's not very often that we actually have certificated securities these days. Now, it is possible, if we didn't have certificated securities, you still could have investment property that's in an account if there's control of the account, but that usually would be like the broker is the lender as well. Yeah.
So subject to the statute of frauds?
Oh, let's not talk about statute of frauds. Don't add that complication because it's going to make her head hurt. So let's not talk about that. All right. So we don't need it for this. Don't worry about it. All right, just let it go. All right. Don't you have enough? I know you took this, but the rest of them didn't. All right. So establish your security interest. What you guys are going to see in Lauren's answer for July 2013 is it's very methodical. You know, did the bank create a security interest? Here are the three things. Did the other lender create a security interest? Here are the three things, right? And so she just kind of, did you create a security interest? Here's the factors. Then you apply them. Did the other guy create a security interest? Here's the factors. Here we apply them. I normally wouldn't say be on the lookout for the oral security agreement, but Florida just did it last summer. And that's actually unusual because usually they're in writing and usually we go straight down this. I know you don't want to know that they're testing those darn little exceptions that no one else tests, but they are. All right. Which exceptions are down here? I think you guys probably have it in your package. All right, and when it comes to in the security agreement, we do have to identify the collateral in our security agreement, whether it's oral or whether it is written. So we can't use a super generic classification. We can't just say, you know, everything that Bob Hatley owns. That's not going to work. So we actually have to identify, you know, the paver, the grader. Now we could use general categories. We could say the debtor's equipment, or the debtor's deposit account, or the debtor's inventory, and that's good enough. But we have to have a reasonably specific description of the collateral. Interesting enough, just a little point, security interest does attach to after acquired collateral and to identifiable proceeds. I would love to say that Florida doesn't care about any of that, but then of course they tested about proceeds last summer as well, so we'll be getting to that. Proceeds is what you get from selling something. And so if we had a security interest in a bank account, follow me here, bank creates a security interest in a bank account, and then you take the money out and you buy a bulldozer. The bulldozer would be proceeds of the bank account, right? And so the bank has, actually it's a 20-day grace period where their security interest continues in the bulldozer. But they do have to go out and take some other actions, which we'll get to. All right, proceeds. Now, as it turns out, even if there's a security agreement, even if we attached our security interest, we may find that the debtor sells the collateral anyway. Bad debtor. So in that case, the debtor can sell in violation of the agreement, but the collateral is encumbered. So you don't want to be buying something with somebody else's security interest on it because you will end up paying the debt. So Florida 2013, look at this. There was questions about, you know, I guess the three requirements, about the security agreement, about whether something had attached, all kinds of great stuff. And then Florida's tested about the second question. Did somebody create a security interest? We can answer that. And then we have to go, well, did somebody perfect their security interest? I like to say that creating a security interest means that the agreement is good between the debtor and the creditor. Creating a security interest makes the agreement good against the debtor and creditor. Perfecting the security interest makes the agreement good against the whole world. Because ordinarily what we're going to do is we're going to file. You know, why do we file a mortgage in the real estate records? Because we want the whole world to know, right? So we have a personal property filing system for the UCC, and so we're going to do the same thing because that's what we do. So not surprisingly, Florida tested this as well, because we create and then we perfect. And so if you look at Lauren's answer, it's going to be, did they create their security interest, or did the security interest attach? And then it's going to be, did they perfect their security interest? Now, the classic way to perfect a security interest is by filing. And language you need to be thinking about is, you'll see someone signed a promissory note. You'll see somebody signed or had an oral security agreement, because that's our first buzzword, right? And then we're going to see somebody filed a financing statement. Not a financial statement, a financing statement. Financing statement. Sometimes they'll put in a problem, they'll call it a UCC1, just to see if they can confuse you. But UCC1 is just the form number for a financing statement. They mean the same thing. All right? So ordinarily, the way we get on record is by, and perfect is the term of art, is by filing a financing statement. In one of the parts of the problem from last year, the lender perfected by filing their financing statement at the Secretary of State's office. And so with this, it is just a form that you fill out. It has the debtor's name on it. It has the creditor's name on it. And again, it identifies the collateral, and it goes in the public records. We don't ordinarily file our security agreement. We just file the darn financing statement. There's no signature required. All right.
No signature.
No signature. But it has to be authorized by the debtor. If the debtor hasn't authorized it, then you can't just go and file, because otherwise I could just go out and file against all y'all and just encumber everything you own just to make havoc and I guess be mischievous, right? So we can't do that, only if it's authorized. Now, ordinarily, when someone applies for credit, that's going to have a security interest. They authorize it then. All right. So we saw that in Florida, perfection by filing. We also saw on Florida, July 2013, perfection by control. Perfection by control. When we're talking about those deposit accounts or investment accounts, not only can we help our creation of a security interest along by control, but we can also perfect by control. Investment property, deposit accounts, electronic chattel paper, and the like. All right? The other possibility is, where do I have it here? Perfection by possession. So if this doesn't happen as often, because usually the debtor wants to possess the car because they need to drive it, right? But sometimes a creditor will possess the collateral, and if they do their security agreement and they don't file, but they possess the collateral, that would be their perfection. But that's an exception. Since Florida tested on 2 methods to perfect last year, I don't think you guys are off the hook for anything, because they didn't even just go filing. They did filing and they did control. And so I think you should bear in mind sometimes possession. I saw a Washington State secure transactions problem. I think it might be in your packet. But they had different types of agreements. They had one that was filed, one that was control, and one that was a possession. So that's a lot. So they had all 3 methods of perfection tested on theirs. Florida tested 2. But if that wasn't enough, Florida also tested proceeds in that question. Are you feeling ill yet? Because they did. And that was after they had 2 different contract disputes. That's why Lauren's answer is 4 pages long. Because they had 2 different contract disputes, and then they had 2 different security interests, perfected in 2 different ways, created in 2 different ways, and then they had the bank money being used in creating the proceeds, and we have a temporary perfection on the proceeds for 20 days. But if you didn't file initially, then you would have to file or perfect in whatever way was appropriate for the collateral that you have within the 20-day period. I know, how are you going to memorize all this? You're going to have to. So 20 days. Beyond the 20 days, it was interesting because in the problem from July, the bank found out that their money was used to buy some equipment, and so within the 20 days, they went out and filed. And that way, their perfection maintained continuously. So what do we think about perfection? I think we can think perfection by filing, perfection by possession, perfection by control, and then perfection with respect to proceeds, good for 20 days, but before the end of 20 days, the lender must re-perfect however they're supposed to. And I say usually it's by filing, but I guess if you had a car, it wouldn't be filing, it'd be a certificate with a DMV. All right. All right, and of course it shouldn't surprise you guys, but when you have to file these financing statements, you have to get the debtor's name correct. Yeah, I know. And I guess just a moment about that, because that was one of the things they amended with the new Article 9. If it's an individual and they have a driver's license, on the financing statement you must use the name on the driver's license, even if it's the wrong name. I haven't seen anyone test that new part of Article 9, but I think all things are available in Florida. Make sure you get the name right on the financing statement. I did see that was in Washington. They actually tested a name issue. Got to get the name right. So my father's name is Dudley Richard Martin. But nobody knows that, because everyone knows him as Rick Martin. Not Ricky, though. Just Rick. And so if someone were to know him, they might think they would file a financing statement under the name of Richard Martin, right? Because that's what he's known by. But if you looked at his driver's license, it says Dudley R. Martin. So what would you have to file under? Dudley R. Martin. So sometimes people have a name that they don't go on. You can't go on under the name that they're commonly used at. You've got to go under the correct name. If it's a corporation, you have to go under the name on, we call it the organic record. And meaning if it's an LLC or a corporation that was formed in Florida, you're going to have to look for the certificate of incorporation or any articles of organization, depending upon where they're filed. If they're organized up in Delaware, you're going to go look at the organic document and use the correct name. Otherwise, the lender doesn't get anything because they use the wrong name. So get the name right. You all good on that? We could spend a whole hour talking about debtor names and craziness. Because do you think that the DMV gets those names right all the time? No, they don't. So when we get to the Florida bar exam, you've got the question and you've got Lauren's answer now. And, I'll be sending Lauren a really nice letter and a baby gift. And Peter has some little coasters for her because she wrote this for you guys. The strategy is to evaluate the creation of the security interest of every lender. Do all the creations first. Then do all the perfections. And then we have to do all the battles. Let's see what I got done here. Before we get to the battles, there's the Florida. I just wanted to say in the next slide, there was a New York bar exam question where they combined family law and Article 9. I know. Because don't you think this might happen? A couple buys a number of items of personal property, refrigerators, furniture and the like, and then they get divorced, but there was a credit agreement. And so, you might have family law issues, but you may also have Article 9 issues. Problem is, just because if the family law court says that you get something and someone else has to pay for it, guess who the creditor can come after? Still you, right? And they can still repossess whatever it is. Because Article 9 prevails over Article 9. I guess you can go complain to family law court, right? All right, so this one's Bob's bedroom. Let's see, what am I say? Oh, before we move on, past the whole perfection thing, I actually have a moment. One other thing. Sorry, there's one more way to perfect a security interest that I didn't mention, and I know, like, oh my gosh, there's one more. And I just want to draw your attention to this one. Automatic perfection. You know, sometimes people go into, like, say, Sears, and they buy a refrigerator on credit, and the register, you know, spits out some kind of security agreement, and they just sign it and hand it to the clerk, and then the refrigerator is delivered to their house. That doesn't surprise any of you guys, right? So they do that, and the way this works is we don't expect Sears to go out and file for every refrigerator that they sell. That would be crazy, right? And so we actually, when we're dealing with purchase money security interests in consumer goods, purchase money, we call it PMSI, purchase money security interest in consumer goods, we actually give automatic perfection for those things. So you might see something like that. The lender is automatically perfected if we have a PMSI in consumer goods. All right, so money that's lent particularly for that. Are we good? You all are going to write for me, right? You guys going to make me crazy because I'm like, I have 100, you know, essays in my box. Just practice. This is one just, I know that it's going to take you a while. You guys should write a security interest on Article 9 problem. You should write an Article 3 problem. Just so you guys don't write your first one on the bar exam. All right. So we set up the security interest. We attach it. Then we perfect it to make it good against everyone else. But the problem is, in July 2013, both creditors did the correct things. They attached their security interests. They perfected their security interests. And so then we have to decide, well, among two creditors, or between two creditors, who wins? Sometimes we have to deal with these disputes, and we call it priority. And so we might say, who has priority in the equipment? Who has priority in the equipment? All right? So if we have, if both parties are unperfected, let's say nobody filed, bless you, then the first one who attached wins. If both parties are unperfected, then the first who attached their security interest. If we have one perfected and one unperfected, then the one that's perfected wins. All right? We have one perfected and one that's unperfected. If we have two that are perfected, which was the case in July 2013, then it's the first to file or perfect. First to file or perfect. And so you've got to date back what was the first day of filing. And, we actually, in that case, we had someone who perfected by control and someone that perfected by filing their financing statement. And we compared the two dates. And we saw which one was first. All right? And I think it was the bank in that case. Now, purchase money security interests have super priority. That is a good general rule. Everything has exceptions. I can't teach you all the exceptions. It's enough already, right? There's a lot of rules here on the priorities. And I'm going to talk about a few of them because we've got a little bit of time left. And the reason why I'm going to talk about them is all these rules are ones that I've seen tested on some of the bars. And so, like Florida picked the both perfected last year, but it was one perfecting by control and one by filing, right? And so, but each of these are battles that I've seen on exams. So, purchase money security interest in inventory, the inventory financer. Sometimes there is more than one inventory financer because imagine a car dealer that sells both Toyotas and Lexus, right? And so they might have a Lexus supplier who has an interest in the inventory, and they might have a Toyota person who has an interest in the inventory, and like, well, who has what, right? And so the way this works is the lender, in order to prevail, must be perfected at the time the debtor gets the inventory. And they have to give notice to the prior creditors. So if we had someone who was a Toyota dealership first, and now they're going to do Lexus, the folks who are going to sell the Lexus are going to perfect, and then they're going to send a notice to the Toyota folks, right, the Toyota lenders. This happens all the time, and this is one that would be very easy to test. You take 2 inventory financiers and you make everybody do the right thing, and then we say which one wins. And usually the one that comes along later will lose unless they gave that notice. So they have to give the notice, and their notice is only good for like 5 years. So sometimes I saw a problem, it was like about a diamond sales, or maybe it was a case. And basically after the 5 years, they continued to sell, and the other person continued to sell, but they didn't renew their notice. And guess what happened? You now go to the back of the line. So we have to maintain everything, right? Under the code, when it comes to Article 9, 5 years is a common number. Our financing statements are good for 5 years. Our notices are good for 5 years. So if, for instance, the loan is for more than 5 years, and we file our financing statement, guess what we're going to have to do before the expiration of 5 years? File a continuation statement. So you got to file again. If you let anything lapse, guess what happens? Back to the end of the line. And so you would lose your priority dispute then. All right. PMSI and equipment. Purchase money, security, interest, and equipment. There's a little bit of a grace period here. If the lender perfects within the first 20 days, after the debtor gets possession of the equipment, then that lender will win, even if there was a prior interest in equipment. Yes?
I thought you said before that the PMSIs perfect automatically upon the transfer of...
Oh, I didn't say that at all. Oh, consumer goods. Easy one to make a mistake about, though, right? Oh, I'm sorry. There's just a lot of rules. It's Article 9. Flashcards. Flashcards. And there will be a lot of them. No way around it. No way around it. All right? So yes, PMSIs in consumer goods automatically perfect, but not in others. If we have conflicting PMSIs, 2 people both lent for the same thing. Everybody lent you money to go buy that new refrigerator, right? If the PMSI is seller financing, seller wins. Otherwise, first to file or perfect. Interestingly enough, if I lent you money to go buy a refrigerator, and then Sears lent you money to buy a refrigerator, it's still purchase money security interest. Presumably we all took security interests, right? But Sears as the seller is going to win if we had that dispute. All right. We're not going to talk about chattel paper because I've not seen that come up. All right. So there are some other things that happen that I guess we could talk about, and the next one is buyers. Let's see what I'm going to say. You know, I guess if somebody buys, I haven't seen this one come up, but I just can't discount anything. If somebody buys, a regular buyer, buys collateral, I guess the bulldozer, right? Gives value and gets gets delivery of the bulldozer without knowledge of the security interest, and while it's not perfected, then they would win. I guess we just don't feel so bad for the other person because they should have perfected their security interest, right? These are all disputes. All this is about disputes. Who wins if we have 2 people? Another possibility is buyers in the ordinary course. If you go and buy the refrigerator down at Sears and you pay for the refrigerator at Sears, we don't really have to worry about whether Sears had inventory financing themselves, because the rules say that you as the buyer take free of any security interest created by your seller, meaning Sears. So you don't have to worry that someone's going to come knocking on your door. Hey, can I have the refrigerator back? We're going to repossess it because Sears didn't pay the bill. No, we don't worry about that. The rule says that the buyer in the ordinary course of business, Sears is in the business of selling appliances, right? So if you bought a refrigerator from Sears, then you would be able to keep it, even against someone who came and wanted it. Consumer to consumer. If we have consumer goods sold by a consumer, meaning like something at a yard sale or on Craigslist, those type of sales, even if there was a security interest, as long as they gave value and there wasn't a filed financing statement, then the new buyer can take it free. Now, a lot of restrictions on this. Has to be consumer to consumer. It can't be business to consumer. It can't be consumer to business. All consumer to consumer, all consumer goods, and it has to be in a situation where nobody has filed, which is most likely to be the situation for the reason we were going back earlier, Bob, for consumer good PMSIs, the lenders don't have to file, so they don't normally. And so if there was an odd situation where a lender had filed, but I just don't know of those situations. Usually the yard sale exception or the Craigslist exception, depending on how you want to look at it, will allow the new buyer of consumer goods, of used consumer goods, to keep them without reference to the security interest. Are we good? There's a lot of disputes. Yes?
Is a car consumer good?
Problem with cars is that cars have certificates on their titles, and so they're only partially governed by Article 9. And you will have, remember, this rule would only work if someone hadn't filed, and there's always a filing on the notation on the car title. And so it wouldn't help you to buy someone's car without knowledge, because it's going to be on the title. Yeah?
Anything with titles like not a consumer good?
No, I didn't say it wasn't a consumer good. I said it wasn't going to help him, because the rule is before the secured party filed. And how do you file against a car? It goes on the certificate of title. So unless some lender didn't put a notation on the title because maybe they just messed up their paperwork, in that case, it would be a consumer good if it was a consumer to a consumer, right? But it's usually just not going to be. I've just never seen a fact pattern on that, because that's not something that could come up.
Yeah, like bicycle though. And
Bicycle, yeah. All kinds, there's only a small group of things that are covered by the certificates of title. Most things are not. But it's consumer to consumer. If you were buying something for your law office, that's not consumer to consumer anymore, right? All right. Almost through these. Couple more battles. All right, the next battle is lien creditors. Remember I said sometimes we might have this whole Article 9 world at play, but sometimes people go to court and they become a lien creditor, right? If we had a lien creditor, the lien creditor is going to beat out the unperfected or unsecured creditors. The unsecured creditors, meaning they don't have a security interest. Security interest, though, will beat a lien creditor if they perfect before the lien attaches. So I guess you want to perfect to beat out the lien before the lien, or the secured party files first and meets one of the attachment requirements. So what we are really looking for is either perfection or filing to beat out a lien creditor, meaning someone who went to court and got a judgment and got a lien. Bankruptcy. Sometimes the debtor has no money and they go to bankruptcy, right? And then you've got a bankruptcy trustee, and you're like, well, can the trustee beat out the Article 9 people? Well, if you're perfected, you beat the trustee in bankruptcy and you get your collateral. Unperfected secured parties, Very sad for them. Guess they should have perfected because they will lose to the bankruptcy trustee. This is a lot of battles. I would say that attaching the interest, perfecting the interest, fairly straightforward. There are a number of variations, but pretty easy. But when it comes to these battles, you don't know which one they're going to pick. They picked, for Florida, 2 perfected secured parties last time. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just the vocabulary, when you say attach, are you saying that's the same as creating the security interest?
You got it. You have to attach it to the collateral. You take your, because you've got to say, hey, we're going to attach to my computer. So you attach the security interest to the computer by following through with those requirements. And that's code speak. So did we create a security interest? It's created by attaching it. It's created when it attaches, we say. So did somebody create a security interest? Did somebody perfect the security interest? Who wins in a dispute between lender 1 and lender 2? That's how these issues play out. Could be more than 2 lenders. It's possible. It could be 3. I've seen 3. Let's see what else, if I have something else for you guys. All right. So I know you guys are already exhausted and this is like a lot, but we're not done. So in your packet, you see a Texas bar exam that I like to call this one computer craziness, because this is one where they combined a BA issue with an Article 9 problem. I know, it could be anything. So don't presume that if you see a wills and trust problem that somehow you're safe from any UCC, because you have to look for the pitch, or if you see a criminal law problem or a family law problem. My suspicion is that they would combine it with contract, but I can't guarantee that. And so you always have to be on the lookout for the odd variation. We don't really have enough precedent with Florida to know how they're going to do it, and other states have combined all kinds of ways. Now, I think this is interesting because what they did here with this one is that this one is, you've got proceeds, you've got computers that are still in inventory, you've got computers that have been sold to a consumer. So yeah, I guess you've got computers in inventory, a computer that's sold, and then you've got a check that's proceeds. And basically, again, this is Texas. I guess you might want to be wishing you were in Texas than the fact that their bar's longer than Florida's. But they actually go ahead and ask the specific questions. Do not expect that Florida is going to ask you the specific questions. Florida is going to say something like, who has rights to the computer and money? And they're just going to be painting it broadly, and you've got to figure it out from there. All right? Call of the question, do not expect that it's going to help you out a whole lot. You're going to have to figure out what the issue is, and then you're going to have to write it. But when it comes to Article 9, these consensual property interests, just follow it straight along. Did somebody create a security interest? Did they perfect a security interest? And then how's the battle? That, it's a fairly straight progression. There is an answer to this because there's PMSIs and everything. All right, I've got one more piece of the Article 9 puzzle, and it relates to default by the debtor and what rights the creditors have. So in Florida last year, they didn't really talk about the repossessions and like. They really were asking about the battle between the creditors. Did they make their security interest? Did they perfect their security interest? And who wins in a battle between them? But that's not always the case. Sometimes the debtor may still have the collateral, right? Because we know that there's this lingering issue about repossession. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a television show about the whole thing, right? So it must be interesting somehow. All right, usually what happens, the code says that upon default, the creditor has certain rights, all right, upon default. Now, default ordinarily is non-payment of the money, or it is actually whatever the loan says. But my suspicion is that they would give you if someone didn't pay the bill as the monthly payment as they were required, and the creditor wants to know what rights they have. So when it comes to repossession, repossession can be done after default, but if the creditor is exercising what we call self-help, meaning they're going to come out to your house in the middle of the night to take your car, they can only repossess without breach of the peace. They can only repossess if they can do so without breach of the peace. If they breach the peace, they violate Article 9, and damages would ensue. And so my guess is if they gave you something like that, it's going to be along the lines of, hey, debtor had defaulted, they owe the money, but the repo guy comes out to the house in the middle of the night, and somebody comes out with a gun, hollering, creating a big ruckus. We're not talking about criminal breach of the peace, but that starts sounding like breach of the peace, right? And what they want you to say is that under Article 9, the creditor is supposed to go away and go to court. They cannot engage in self-help if they would breach the peace. Yes, it can be a factual question about whether somebody is breaching the peace, but we certainly are not going to advise our clients to breach the peace because that might be bad. Not only under Article 9, who knows if that's a criminal issue as well. But we're not talking about criminal breach of the peace because that's a different standard. But at least for Article 9, no self-help if there is a possibility of breaching the peace. Interestingly enough, there are cases out there that have said even if the person doesn't come out with a gun and threaten you, the repo guy, if there's a big risk that that would happen, then they can't repossess either because there's a threat to the breach of the peace. So, you know, if the car that you want to repossess, it's her car, but it's on your land out in the middle of, you know, the hinterlands, and it's parked there, it's very remote, and it's in the middle of the night, you know, there's a risk that you would come out and shoot somebody, right? And so if there's even that potential risk, that's considered to be a breach of the peace, right? So, you know, actual breach of the peace, no self-help. Severe risk to breach of the peace, you're still not supposed to do, it's still considered a breach of the peace. My suspicion is you'd have something that really is a breach of the peace or something that's not. Small objections are not breach of the peace. I really wish you wouldn't do that. Oh, I really need that car. That's not quite enough, right? Or let me call the lender, please. You know, but there's cases where they have driven off with the people in the car hollering and creating a big ruckus and screaming, and you know, so there's lots of things that could happen even beyond what you guys have seen on TV. So no self-help if it would be a breach of the peace. All right, otherwise it's okay, they can still repossess, they just got to go to court. Once the creditor repossesses, we have some rules of the road. All right, let's presume we now have gotten, this is the question Florida did not ask. Once the lender has repossessed the collateral, what happens, right? Not just who has rights to the collateral, say, hey, they have rights to the collateral, what's going to happen now? So there is supposed to be a commercially reasonable sale. It can be public or private. There's supposed to be notice to the debtor about the sale. Now, once the sale happens, the expenses of the sale happen first. The secured debt is paid. Any junior lenders get paid. And if there's a surplus, the debtor gets the surplus. If there's a deficiency, the debtor must pay the deficiency. You all right on that? Shouldn't surprise you that that's the order where the money goes. All right. Sometimes, yes?
So you can't breach the peace, but they do, and they have the collateral now.
Well, that's, it's probably beyond, that's really this one here. Can I wait on that then? I'll get to it. Presuming, I only have 10 more minutes, but I'll try. All right. So the other possibility is the creditor might not sell the goods. You might have heard of things called strict foreclosure, where a creditor, like with mortgages, will not go for the deficiency. They'll just take title to the property. We have that in Article 9 as well. And the way this happens in Article 9, and this came up on a Texas bar exam, so if you want to think, well, maybe they just won't ever ask that. Well, it did come up in Texas. So strict foreclosure, the creditor would propose this to the debtor. Hey, I'm just going to keep that piece of equipment in satisfaction of the debt. And either the debtor accepts or they just don't respond and they have 20 days to respond. All right? So sometimes a creditor will just say, I don't want to mess with all this notice and all this sale business. I'm just going to take it and I'll sell it when I want, how I want, and I'm not going to worry about that deficiency, right? So if that happens, either because there's acceptance by the debtor or they just don't respond in 20 days, in complete satisfaction, it fully satisfies the debt, and except that you can't do this for consumer goods where the debtor has paid 60% of the secured price. So we can do this strict foreclosure except for consumer goods where the consumer has paid 60% of the secured debt. The reason for this is we just worry about strong arming of the consumers where they paid most of the debt. In the area of non-consumer goods, we could do a partial satisfaction agreement. So partial satisfaction agreement. There would be an agreement, the debtor would be liable for the balance, but we can't do this for consumer goods. So maybe we have some restrictions when it comes to doing consumer goods, meaning you either, you've got to sell. You've got to sell unless it's less than 60% of the price of the debt. I have seen bar examiners ask that question for consumer goods because it's a consumer protection issue. All right, rights to redemption. I don't know if you've ever heard about someone going to the foreclosure sale and redeeming whatever it was that is up for sale. So debtors have rights for redemption anytime before the disposition. So anytime before, I guess, the proverbial hammer falls on an auction sale. And the way they have to do this, they have to pay all the debt. Not just the back payments, they must pay all the debt plus the expenses in order to redeem. All the debt plus the expenses. Last part, and you're like, oh, thank the Lord. All right, last one, failure to comply with the code. You repossess and you take some poor woman's car and breach the peace doing it. I know she hadn't paid the bill, but she has rights as a debtor. And at that point, then she loses her job. All kinds of bad things happen. Creditor's liable for all actual damages, and it could be big. Creditors are liable for all actual damages for any violation of the code. So if you breach the peace, you are responsible because you have to go. I know it might take 30 days to go back to court to get that car, but that's what the creditor is obliged to do. The self-help remedy is very limited. You cannot overstep that, or you will be liable for every bad thing that happens to that debtor by not going to court when you're supposed to. Question?
No, I was going to say, like, she loses her job because
Yep.
she took her car.
Yes.
It has to be an actual consequence of your action.
Actual damages. Any actual damages, though, and it could be big. You know, maybe someone else, she loses a maybe like a professional license, or her bank then called. There was a case where a bank called a loan because of something where a creditor tried to call something that they had no grounds to do so, and it caused him to lose his business license and some special insurance he needed for livestock, and the amount that the creditor had to pay for violations was hundreds of thousands of dollars. So bad, bad, bad. Don't do that. And obviously for the bar, all you've got to say is the creditors are liable for all actual damages for violating the code. The code presumes the value of the collateral is equal to the amount of the debt otherwise. So if creditors screw around with this, then they do kiss their ability to get a deficiency goodbye. If it's consumer goods, there might be consumer gets the credit service charge plus 10% of the principal obligation. So there are actually some other penalties written in there in addition to actual damages. And so, yes, there are some things that could happen. It's not a good idea. And on the bar, of course, you're just going to say all actual damages for violations of the code, because that's what the examiners are going to want you guys to say. There is a question at the end of the PowerPoints that you guys should consider looking at. Another Texas question called, that I like to call the knuckler. It's about a baseball pitching machine and some type of paper folding machine. And in here, they have issues where it was accepted is full satisfaction of a debt. There was consumer goods. He wanted to then redeem his collateral. So all kinds of things going on in that problem. There is some guidance on how to answer the knuckler. There are a lot, what you guys should see is that when it comes to Article 9, there are a lot of roads you might go down. I think the Article 3 roads are a little bit more limited, but in Article 9 there are a lot of different things that could happen in the story, and you're going to have to figure out in the end how it resolves. All right, guys, thank you. Send me some essays to read. I will try and have an answer for you.